today. I'm Patrick Cronin. I'm the Asia Pacific Security Chair here at the Hudson Institute. And today it's a great privilege to have with us Professor Hew Strachan and to talk about some very big questions, the causes and consequences of war. This is a collaborative program with the American University, and it is a great honor to have Professor Audrey Kurth Cronin, Distinguished Professor at American University, introduce Hew Strachan. Thank you.
Hello, and thank you very much for coming. I'm here to introduce Professor Hew Strachan, who should be well known to many of you. His writings are prolific. He's the preeminent military historian in the world, I would argue, and it's our honor to have him here. Professor Hew Strachan is the Bishop Wardlow Professor at the University of St Andrews in St Andrews, Fife, Scotland. He's published widely on military history from the 18th century to the present, and is widely recognized as the, as I just said, preeminent military historian of our time. His books cover the full range of topics in history, strategy, and policy, including the history of European armies, the British Army, the experience of soldiers in the field, and the writings of Carl von Clausewitz, all subjects on which he's globally known. Professor Strachan also publishes regularly on contemporary topics in strategic studies and on the present and future evolution of warfare. He's perhaps best known for his brilliant books on the First World War, especially To Arms, which examines the causes of that war and is related to what we'll be talking about today. Professor Strachan is a Life Fellow at Corpus Christi College, Cambridge, where he began his academic career. From there, he became Professor of Modern History at the University of Glasgow. In 2002, he was named titular Professor of the History of War and University Academic Fellow of All Souls College, Oxford University, where he remains an Emeritus Fellow. He was founding director of the Oxford Leverhulme Program on the Changing Character of War from 2004 to 2015, and that's where we met. He then moved to St Andrews in 2015. He's a tireless mentor to younger scholars and military members, having built a strong staple of followers and admirers throughout the world. You may be interested, in addition, to know that in his early years, Professor Strachan was a merchant seaman for a short time, and he also did archaeological work in Sudan. In addition to his academic career and writings, Strachan has been deeply involved in advising the British government on strategy and policy, including throughout the recent wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. In 2013, he was knighted by the Queen for services to the UK Ministry of Defense. So it's an honor for us to welcome Professor Hew Strachan, who will be speaking to us today about the causes of war and their consequences.
Audrey and Patrick, thank you so much, and thank you for such a warm welcome. It's wonderful to be here in Washington and through the day, those of us who are in Scotland. I'm going to begin with all sorts of familiar topics, and what could be in one level about war and talking about causes. If I'm going to talk about causes and I'm going to talk about war, I'm going to start with Clausewitz. War is merely the continuation of policy by other means. When, as they frequently do, commentators cite Clausewitz, the most profound as well as the most famous analyst of war, they do so to make that point above all others. It is as though, without Clausewitz imprimatur, the reader will not grasp what is taken to be a central truth. But it's also a warning. As Clausewitz continued, the political object is the goal, war is the means of reaching it, and means can never be considered in isolation from the purpose. Statesmen who embark on war are reminded that means can too easily become ends in themselves, and so strip war of its purpose. From this reading, the political aim which precipitates war becomes the context within which to contain it, and without policy, war's inherent violence lacks utility or justification. Escalate, become self-fulfilling, and so reverts to its primordial condition, which is simply destruction. And Liberal Democrats have embraced this Clausewitzian ideal with fervour. It creates a master narrative to rationalise the resort to war. It begins with policy and the expectation that it shapes strategy, which in turn determines operational and tactical choices. Strategic planning rests on the presumption that war is a linear process. Its logic is simultaneously hierarchical and sequential. Its idealized form, war is designed so that it delivers the objectives which reflect the reasons for which states have undertaken it in the first place. From its causes comes its course, and from its conduct emerges consequences. According to this model, the war's origins are reflected in its outcomes. The trouble is, for most of the time, they do no such thing. The belief that the causes and consequences of war trace a straight line, following a logic that is continuous, is perversely at odds with the reality. Of course, there have been reasons. There have been moments when the reasons for which states have gone to war have been fulfilled in the consequences that have resulted. But they have been extraordinarily rare. The dominant example for a modern historian is the wars of German unification. And indeed, it is that that has underwritten much of this reading of Clausewitz in subsequent years. In 1866 and 1870, if there are Danes here, I better add in 1864, a couple of short, sharp wars which delivered on Otto von Bismarck's aim to unite Germany under Prussian domination seem to show that war and policy were ideally meshed. But those two examples are exceptions which prove the rule. A rule which, ironically, was expressed in its opposite form by the Chief of the General Staff at both conflicts, the elder Moltke, who said at the same time, no strategic plan succeeds beyond the first contact with the enemy. The degree to which this happens, even in wars that seem successful, is hidden in practice by hindsight. We judge a war's success afterwards, but we achieve success in a war without any advanced knowledge of what that outcome will be. So what happens effectively is we create a subsequent narrative, this is pretty self-evident really, which is that of inevitable triumph, or perhaps inevitable defeat, which tends to underplay the fact that war is a reciprocal act. He Clausewitz point. It takes two sides to have a war. The enemy is, after all, trying to fulfill his aims, not yours. And if you are successful, by definition, the enemy is unlikely to have been so. For one side, the continuum from causes through course to outcomes fails. We forget that too often, because history tends to be written by the victors. I've referred to 1866 and 1870 specifically. The challenges of maintaining any sort of continuum between causes, course, and consequence ought to be pretty self-evident to anybody in this room, given the recent experiences in the post-9/11 wars. The eventual outcomes from the invasion of Iraq in 2002, Iraq in 2003, and even the intervention in Libya in 2011, are all moulded by initial operational success, yet all ending in protracted conflicts which each succeeded the First or the Second World Wars at length, and of course, not always in an success, in one case, in clear defeat. Those wars suggest that this linear progression rarely occurs. As a result, there is, and was in those wars, no clear alignment between means and ends. We now like to think, I think we can safely say, and you might want to challenge me with this, has come under challenge. It's associated with other wars, also can be defined as unsuccessful. But in many ways, the post-9/11 wars were limited wars for the United States and for its allies. We rarely stopped to ask sufficiently, fiercely, just how they were limited. They were not limited in their initial objectives. After all, this was subsumed under the title, they were subsumed under the of the global war on terror. Rather, they were limited in their means. Neither the United States nor its allies committed the full might of their military capabilities to the execution of those conflicts. So from the start, the political aims and the military means were not in alignment. Because the aims were too broad and too ill-defined, nobody knew what success would look like, and it became less clear as insurgents and civil war followed. The latter meant that limited military means were no longer adequate. As you know, the efforts at military level were increased, the surge in Iraq in 2007, and then in Afghanistan in 2010. The limits were now defined somewhat differently. They were determined in terms of time, even more than effect. But there was still no redefinition of what the military objective might be. If war is not limited in its political objectives, it cannot simply be limited in terms of its means. But the US believed it could be, and none of its allies presumed to question that presumption. Despite this, the narrative of operational success, planning and execution of campaigns, was continuous throughout the last 20 years, but was rewarded, as you know, with persistent political failure. I'll say more about why this might be the case in a moment. What I want you to do now is just flip the narrative, put yourself in another, and look at in a different position, and look at those three campaigns from the other side. First of all, there is intervention in the name of counterterrorism, democracy, and good governance. Second, there is resistance by terrorists and guerrillas, which leads to counterinsurgency. Third, there is the morphing of counterinsurgency to the point where it ceases to be an operational method and becomes the strategy itself. This happened in Iraq after 2006 and in Afghanistan after 2009. And the object now seems to be to create a security situation sufficient for somehow a political solution to emerge without any clear sense of what that political solution might be. And then we might add on the fourth stage, which is essentially a new form of counterinsurgency, less about boots on the ground and hearts and minds, and more about the use of drones and special forces. Again, a strategy in itself, but with the situation on the ground largely in the hands of local forces, and again, no real sense of what a political outcome would look like. There is still no alignment here between means and ends. Now, if that is the model, by all means, I'm sure there'll be some kickback. I'm expecting the incoming fire. Let me just look at this from the other side, the same set of conditions. Look at an alternative narrative for Afghans, Iraqis, and Libyans. Now the story is not one of intervention, but of invasion. Met, of course, not from a welcome by subject peoples who are delighted to be freed from tyranny, but by a people who rally to their leaders, who can resume the mantle of representing their nations because there is external intervention. There is still some success, as you know, in the early stages, because one of the things armed forces do well, and the American armed forces do particularly well, is high-intensity combat operations for which they have planned and for which they execute to a very high standard. But at the political level, what we're now looking at is not counterinsurgency, but insurgency itself. What Western troops were doing from 2002 onwards, after all, was not propping up an existing old order in Afghanistan, that is to say the Taliban government, but overthrowing that existing order, just as the West toppled Saddam Hussein and Gaddafi. Why do we talk about our doing, Colin, when we were the revolutionaries? We have been the causes of instability and insecurity. And when we set about stabilization operations, I remember having exactly this discussion in 2009 as the British were trying to produce the stabilization doctrine. When we set about stabilization operations, it has been to end the instability for which we have been at least to some extent responsible, certainly at the local level. The danger here is that the planning and execution of campaigns, when Because this is a process taught at staff, defense colleges, war colleges, in proper professional circumstances, is better done than is the framing of the policy that shapes the decision to go to war in the first place, or the framing of the post-conflict aims that ought to guide both the policy and the operations. What this highlights at bottom is that Clausewitz was wrong, at least in practice, if not in theory. War is often not the continuation of policy by other means, and that is particularly true for 21st century Western democratic states. 3 key points here. First of all, democracies are now associated with stability, prosperity, and peace. Go out onto Penn Avenue now. This is a society at peace. Democratic peace embodies some of those ideas. Democracies don't go to war with each other. And so for democracies, going to war is not a continuity, but a fundamental shift. It is a response to the failure of policy, not to its fulfillment by other means. Secondly, violence is central to war. Killing people and having your own people killed changes the conversation, changes the dynamic. It makes negotiation much harder. Poincaré famously said in 1914 that he did not need a British expeditionary force to go to France. He just needed one soldier, but he needed that soldier to be killed. Because at that point, Britain had a stake in what happened thereafter. And we have plenty of evidence of how that loss of life can protract conflict, not least in Afghanistan, where death rates make it very hard for anybody to admit that things were going wrong because our boys died in vain. Thirdly, war is a reciprocal act. If policy possesses continuity, for example, in relation to the government's health or education policy or any other sort of domestic policy, it is because government is operating in a less resistant environment than war is. I'm not saying it's not a resistant environment, it's just a bit easier possible. Political debate in a democracy is not war, at least not most of the time, and I will come back to that briefly. War has an escalatory dynamic and has a capacity to go in unpredictable directions precisely because it is not under one government's control. War, therefore, tends to trump policy, not policy. The realities of the battlefield and the capabilities at the operational level define what is possible and necessary more than do policy and politics. And once the war is underway, then policy can be shaped by war precisely because powers need allies. They need to fight in certain ways to accommodate them. They want to gain allies. And so let me say a bit more about what Clausewitz was saying when he talked about the relationship between war and policy. When Clausewitz addressed the relationship between war and policy, he was not talking about the causes of war. On war, von Krieger does what it says on the tin. It is on war. It is not on the causes of war. Too many IR theorists and too many journalists ignore that point when they quote Clausewitz. Clausewitz was interested in how policy shaped the course of a war once it was not underway, not how it got a state into war in the first place. For him, policy had 2 roles within war. Number 1, it could contain war by setting definable, manageable objectives. This is how we have tended to read on war ever since Michael Howard and Peter Gray produced their translation in 1976. And it reflects at least one of the 2 sorts of wars, which Clausewitz defined in his prefatory note to on War of 1827, essentially a war for liberty and justice. But secondly, it can escalate war. In Clausewitz's own times, the French Revolution set objectives which expanded war precisely because the revolution liberated the powers of the state for the purposes of war. War and policy are more in harmony when states are fighting an existential conflict, as we would call it today, and ganzer Krieg, as it is in Clausewitz, not what he necessarily meant an existential conflict in the current sense. What he meant was something that is an entire war, a whole war. And of course, that is the sort of war that most insurgents in Afghanistan or in Iraq were fighting. They really were in this for the whole hog. This was not a limited conflict. Many of today's problems on the policy operational fault reflect that there is no such harmony within war for us. It is why we too readily default to the Second World War or our models, because that was the last time that war and policy were fully integrated for Western democratic societies. So Clausewitz's point is that war is not limited of itself. But there is a further point. In Clausewitz's theory, war is a means to an end, and the end is policy. But that in itself begs a whole raft of questions, because policy is itself a means. Governments have policies to do something, to acquire territory, to effect regime change, to fulfill humanitarian objectives. By pretending that policy is an end, we put ourselves in a position where we can be fuzzy and uncertain what our specific political objectives are. It's worth recalling the historical context within which Clausewitz wrote on war. In Clausewitz's time, the king, at least his father's king, Frederick the Great, or the emperor of France, Napoleon, united political and military authority. The potential for unity between the reasons for going to war and its conduct lay in the consistency of one autocratic ruler. Broadly speaking, Frederick II got the balance right. He fought an initial war after assuming the throne to acquire Silesia. He then fought a much longer and bloody war for Prussia in the shape of the 7 Years' War in order to hang on to Silesia, and then effectively he stopped fighting for the last 23 years of his reign, the sole exception of the war in which almost nobody was killed over the Bavarian succession. Napoleon is very different. He did not enjoy the privilege of inheritance. His legitimacy did not depend on the fact that he was a Bourbon, because he wasn't. He was a Bonaparte. And the consequence was that his right to rule depended on victory on the battlefield. That went fine when one victory followed another. It failed to go fine when one defeat followed another. So from 1812 onwards, he has to regain his legitimacy. And he does that finally in 1815 by going back to where he began, to the roots of his success, by saying he stands for the French Revolution, not for dynasties, not for the right for a Bonaparte to rule, but for the idea that he stands for the embodiment of the nation will. The point here is that in Napoleon's hands, war itself had become political. It is a clash of ideologies, of revolutionary values expressed in the thought of liberty, equality, and fraternity, dealing with the challenges of autocracies and tyranny. So in this formulation in Clausewitz's day, war is not simply the continuation of policy by other means, but also the continuation of politics by other means. In 1815, the rulers of Europe concluded that the terrible wars of the last 20 years had resulted directly from the French Revolution. It followed, therefore, that if you could prevent revolution, you could also prevent war. We now tend to forget how much the role of armed forces throughout the 19th century was defined in terms of their capability to maintain domestic order and to prevent revolution at home. The distinctions which we draw between interstate war and civil war, between revolution and insurgency, and their association with intrastate war, are in many ways a product of the establishment by the state of a monopoly over the use of force. In the 17th century, one allied into the other. In other words, you could have what we call an interstate war and an intrastate war going on simultaneously. From 1648 to 1789, states increasingly enforced that monopoly of military force within the state. And both trends deepened in the 19th century. The effect was to take wars which were indeed centrally about politics, by which I mean civil wars. What can be a greater use of war for the purposes of policy than the Civil War? It hardly needs me to say that to apply to the United States, especially when we're talking about the 19th century, what can be so forceful a reminder than Civil War, and why does that get extracted from the mainstream of military? Why is it that armies, even during the 19th century, are putting civil war and revolution to one side? Partly, of course, because in 1848 there were revolutions throughout Europe, as there was revolution in 1789, but those revolutions did not actually prompt interstate war, except at a most limited level. Pre-1914 military thought did something else too. It began to eliminate the idea that states go to war for territory, Frederick the Great and Caesar of Silesia, or that they go to war for monetary gain. Today, we are so persuaded that war is unproductive in economic terms and so destructive that only lunatics undertake it, that we forget that for most of recorded history, states have gone to war to make money, to acquire territory, and to seek profit. The arguments that we deploy today would have made no sense to a Roman, just as they made very little sense to Napoleon. The oldest cause of war is not policy, but possession. Possession of others' wealth and women. European states fought wars for empire between 1815 and 1914, but did so against non-European peoples rather than within Europe, and so, of course, the profile of these wars was rather less. But these were undoubtedly wars of conquest. And the US, of course, fought its own, the Philippines and Cuba. And, of course, wars of conquest and control had not disappeared even within Europe after 1815, but they were increasingly couched in different terms. So when states aspired to be nations, as Prussia desired to become a nation, a larger nation, to become Germany, you didn't call it conquest, you called it unification. And the same applies, of course, in the case of Italy. And that notion that you could look at territorial exchange in rather different terms if you use the words of nationalism and the nation itself, reached its high point in 1919 at Versailles, when one of Woodrow Wilson's points found forceful application, the idea of national self-determination, something which how to cling on to Europe for the next 4 years, as squabbles emerged about ethnicity, royalty, and definitions of what exactly a nation was. Nor did economic drivers also disappear from them. We forget now how important the idea of economic control was both to Nazi Germany and to Second World War Japan. That many of the drivers here were exactly about the principles of autarky, self-sufficiency, the need for territory, the control of markets, and so on. But the persistence of both currents was overshadowed and lost from sight because in the West, during the course of the 20th century, we have deified the idea that war is a political instrument, and its aim is to create a form of political homogeneity on a path to a more peaceful order. The First World War was defined at the time as a war for civilization, a war for international law, a war to check Prussian militarism. The Second World War is by standard now defined as a war for liberalism against Nazism, but also, of course, it becomes a war against communism, seen as the greatest threat, first of all, by Germany, and seen as a greater threat than Germany at the end of the First World War, seen by the Germans, of course, as the greatest threat to Europe in the course of the Second World War, and then, of course, the Cold War seen as the greatest threat to capitalism. All nurtured an idea that if their result, the result of those three confrontations in the case of the Cold War, was the basis for a new global world order, then peace would follow. In all three conflicts, First and Second World War and the Cold War, revolution, insurgency, and subversion were reintroduced into the repertoire of interstate war. but we tend to overlook them. We tend to overlook that both Britain and Germany used revolution as a weapon of war to undermine their enemies in 1914-18. And of course, we tend to overlook the point I've already made, which is once the US entered the war in 1917 and determined that this was a war for national self-determination, then that took that whole process to a higher level. Woodrow Wilson initially believed that American democracy was sui generis, something not for export. But by 1919, he believed that to be represented at the Versailles Peace Conference, the state should be a democracy in the first instance. And if it were a democracy, then it could be there. His desire was subverted by Britain, who said, of course, it wanted India to have a separate representation. People quite reasonably pointed out that India was not democratically governed, but the British had their way. And so the principle of who would be there and how they would be represented was transformed from that ideal version of the state should be represented. Wilson now believed that democracy could be exported and that democratic states would be inherently peaceful, an element to this. Wilson's dream failed in the 1930s, but it never died. FDR resuscitated in the Second World War. He defined US goals in January 1942 as 4 essential freedoms: freedom of speech and expression, freedom of religion, freedom from want, and freedom from war. He couched these as universal principles, but they were also expressions of America's manifest destiny, ideological in content and uncompromising in their demands. And to give effect to these demands, he recreated the body which failed in the 1930s, to say the League of Nations, as the United Nations. Nations now embodied value systems whose reach extended beyond national frontiers in a rhetoric which made compromise impossible because they were effectively definitions of those nations. Moreover, in addition to that pressure, there were the practicalities in the post-1945 world of alliance politics. Individual states within alliances, both in the 2 world wars and since then in NATO or, for example, in the EU, have had individual national objectives, quite rightly, and we respect that and understand it. The trouble is, the more detailed and specific the national political objectives, the more divisive they probably become. So the reverse has been much easier. Let's have lots of big ideas that we can all agree to, which are grandiose but imprecise, which stress common values like democracy and freedom, rather than political differences. Defeat could not be accommodated because it would mean the death of the value system itself. By linking war and policy, democratic states committed themselves to the use of war, or to a use of war, which had implied that it was likely to be existential. So where are we today? The answer, of course, like you, I too am confused. Let me show that confusion in 2 ways. First of all, by looking at IR theory, only briefly and very superficially, and by looking at domestic political debate. Neither provides a narrative which links the causes of war to its course and its consequence. First of all, words from a man who now pretends he's a professor of IR, but very clearly is a historian, some words on IR. IR theory is conventionally divided into realists who see the state and its survival in an anarchic world as the main drivers of the international system, on the one hand, and idealists on the other, who see things in much more optimistic and progressive terms. The latter are fans of multilateral organizations and of the idea of the democratic peace. Both sides have powerful pedigrees. The realists look to Clausewitz, certainly, but above all to Hobbes, and the idealists look to Rousseau and Kant. To see international behavior as a dialogue between these 2 positions is fine, and actually quite instructive, of course. But to see the origins of any particular group in terms of either realism or idealism rarely is. just look at the reactions of the US public to the two world wars. In 1917, most Americans sympathized with the Allies in their war against Germany. But what they were not prepared to do, in that sense, they were idealists. They saw the values of democracy being defended by France and Britain, but they were not prepared to draw the conclusion that realists would draw, that the US would have to do some fighting, even though the principles which linked the US to France and Britain were those of democracy. And a not dissimilar pattern prevailed up until Pearl Harbor in 1945. Over Ukraine today, publics similarly and simultaneously carry signs of realism and idealism. They bemoan, quite rightly, the fate of the Ukrainian people and think something should be done about it, recoil from the use of war as a response. Neither liberalism nor realism is independently able to explain how the governments of today's democratic states go to war, and nor very often are those governments themselves able to explain their reasoning. Often realism can indeed trigger war, but then liberal internationalism is used to justify it once it is underway. So the invasion of Afghanistan may have been designed to eliminate a haven for international terrorism, but the war then morphed for many into a war to create a more democratic and just society in Afghanistan. The result is a practice in the use of war by democratic states which rests on the following presumptions, which are again contradictory. One, we have a prescription against the use of war by sovereign states, reflected, of course, in the Charter. It is this prescription which makes governments reluctant to go to their parliaments or to Congress for approval for military action. Secondly, a presumption that war is a failure of policy and therefore a real difficulty in coordinating war and policy arises. Western democratic powers use war reactively, not positively. And so they find those who, like Putin, are not so inhibited, very hard to deal with. The moment for Western intervention in Ukraine, or over Ukraine, certainly was not in 2022, by which point it was far too late. Thirdly, a tendency to gloss over these difficulties by talking up the rhetoric associated with war. The amalgam of appeasement used by Tony Blair in 2003, or Pearl Harbor used by Bush in 2001, is evidence of this. Their successors have spoken in more modulated and cautious tones. From Obama to Biden, you have experience of this in the United States. But of course, as they came down from the priorities created by strong language in the aftermath of 9/11, what they say then sounds weak in its utterance. Fourth, a tendency to overpromise but underdeliver, which arises from this use of excessive rhetoric. A reluctance to embrace the language of limited war when that's all you intend to fight, which would therefore more accurately reflect the situation in which the West found itself. Fifthly, all these tendencies are deepened by the need to act as an alliance, even if only a coalition of the willing, in order to achieve legitimacy and in order to achieve generate sufficient combat power, given the reluctance to dedicate the resources required to achieve victory and then to commit to long-term stabilization. But by acting as an alliance, the political purposes that are achievable tend to reflect the lowest common factor rather than the highest common denominator. Let me conclude, if you allow me one more minute, actually, without braining me. Let me conclude with Ukraine. Russia has invaded in what is unequivocally a war of aggression. It is also unequivocally and consequently a justified war for Ukraine, even by the standards of the UN Charter. It's a war of self-defense. Moreover, unlike the entries to Iraq and Afghanistan, Russia's intervention was an invasion. Moreover, fortunately for Ukraine, unlike those entries into Iraq and Afghanistan, it was not characterized by early operational success, although we do need to remind ourselves that Russia currently controls about 25% of Ukrainian territory. For Ukraine today, causes, course, and consequence are linear and aligned. But that linearity does not apply to those who are supporting Ukraine in the West. First of all, the war began with a catastrophic political failure, a profound discontinuity, a failure of deterrence, and a realization that there had to be a reset. Secondly, the West is now committed, at least in its rhetoric, to Ukraine's victory. It is unclear what that means for Ukraine, and according to that rhetoric too, if it does mean existential conflict for Ukraine, it should mean existential conflict for us. Thirdly, we have applied the means of limited war. Well, that is to say, we're providing money and munitions, the United States in particular is doing so, and we are effectively, therefore, fighting once again a proxy war. We're enabling the fighting to go on. But fourthly, we don't know what our desired outcomes are. For some, it is to stop the fighting in Ukraine. For others, it is to push back to the frontiers that existed before the 24th of February. For some, it is to recover the Crimea for Ukraine. And that now includes the majority of those Ukrainians whose views can hold. And for some, again, it is to bring down Putin and to change Russia from within. It is hard to place any of this within a narrative of causes, force, and consequence. We're once again using limited means to cover a political void, not to provide a political solution. Thank you very much.
Well, Hew, thank you so much. The breadth of your remarks, the depth of your scholarship are always edifying and just a treat for us. This is a bit of a hybrid conversation, half lecture and then conversation, sort of like hybrid war. We've sort of sneaked in a lecture here, but we're richer for it, Hew. And I want to turn to Audrey to ask the first question.
And it's an honor. You know, I was thinking when you talked about wars of unification, that's exactly the phrase that Putin uses. So, you know,
Good
looking
point.
at it from the other side,
Oh, yep.
not endorsing it, but still.
No.
Well, I wanted to ask you something that's very American and sort of civil military relations oriented. And, you know, I spent many years teaching at the National War College. And I'm going to go on territory that I tread on very tentatively because it's yours, and I'm sure you'll find things that are wrong in my interpretation. But as you know, Clausewitz's famous dictum, war is the continuation of. So the word is politic.
Yeah.
And you're mainly using the word policy, although you do refer to politics. Whereas, you know, I think it's also fair to say that it could be war as a continuation of politics. Mm-hmm. So one of the reasons why Clausewitz is so popular in the United States, of course, is that Michael Howard and Peter Perret published their translation with the word policy in the aftermath of the Vietnam War. And so the Army and many other services as well were very disappointed and angry about having lost that war and felt that the loss of the war was the result of civilian leadership and bad policy. So it very well suited. I honestly don't think that the United States would have begun teaching Clausewitz in the aftermath, you know, in the way that it does now, had it not been for the arrival of that brilliant translation in 1976 in the midst of all that. So as background to what I really wanted to ask you about, so in the aftermath of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, I think we're in a similar period now in the United States. I think using the word politics may also better suit Clausewitz's Book One argument about the role of the passions of the people. So the word policy kind of leaves that out a bit, doesn't it? So my question is, putting aside the war in Iraq, where absolutely I completely agree with you. Nonetheless, the war in Afghanistan, I'd argue that it was not a war of policy at all. It was a war of politics from the beginning. And that war was forced upon the United States. There was no linear development of policy in 2001. There was a renaming of it as we went forward against the opposition of people like me, frankly. And the passions of the American people drove the war in Afghanistan. And then politics drove mission creep, which changed the military objective from eliminating al-Qaeda, which is what it should have been, to, again, regime change and democratization and so forth. So my question is, how does the argument fit particularly the US role in the war in Afghanistan?
Well, I take the point absolutely about politics when we come back, indeed, to the problems of the Howard and Perret translation. But Michael Howard was always pretty clear in defense of using policy. I think you were probably at that conference lots of I hope Michael wouldn't come, and he did. And this precisely arose. And I've been thinking about it and writing about it again recently. With Michael's death, it's become easier to do these things. It is clear that he and Peter Perret wanted to and that's very odd, particularly for Peter Perret, because he absolutely understood how important the passion side of war was to Clausewitz, how much he hated the French, how this was a war in which the people would have to be mobilized, in which there would be popular participation. And he, not least thanks to the recent biography of Marion von Bruhl of Clausewitz's wife, which brings out just how much she was central to the debates in his life about politics. He was very politically aware, as he was bound to be, given the fact that he was seen as a character politically. When you actually swap sides and fight for the other side, it does suggest, as he did in 1812 against the Prussians, then you realize just how an insubordinate colonel can behave, and how you imagine that happening in a US context now. How does that work out in relation to Afghanistan? Well, I think it's not just how you portray Afghanistan. It's also, how you portray the American response to Afghanistan. It's how you portray Afghanistan. Because the politics of Afghanistan, if we took part of Marquesian's book, for example, now, were absolutely with all those tribal loyalties, all the competition within government, and all this is central to the war. The last time I went to Afghanistan was in 2016, and I stayed 1 week with the British Army, by several quarters, most of the time, the second year. The second time, I stayed with Afghans. And one evening, my Afghan host came in and said, Hugh, there's been a coup. And I said, Faiz, I don't think there's been a coup. He said, no, but it feels like that every day. And what he was talking about was the tension between Ghani and Abdullah, which just pulled that government apart. And at that stage, I thought we were going to fail in Afghanistan, but not because of the Taliban, but because of the ruptures within government. And it's not about corruption or all the things that have been leveled against Ghani. It was simply that division within government. And of course, the problem there was that the US had itself acted politically, party politically in Afghanistan, in supporting Ghani as its choice for president over Abdullah, just as it supported Karzai. So it's not just the politics of the US that play out. It's the politics of Afghanistan and the reciprocal effects of those two things that are going both ways. So is the implication of the question that if we had translated, or if Howard and Perret had translated politique as politics more often, or certainly got the context right when Clausewitz might have been thinking about politics, which undoubtedly was from time to time. Although when he's very, very specific about politics, as he is in some of his histories, then he does lots of different he talks essentially about politics and partisan politics. Then, if we had been more open about that, then the United States would be more simply and is it the case? Part of the point is we talk about popular reactions to 9/11, which of course absolutely impelled the government to do something. It could not have done nothing about the 9/11 attacks. I entirely accept that. The question is thinking through what we do, in a coherent and logical way and recognizing the third order consequences. And if you have that groundswell of popular support for military action, which is what we are now confronting in many, certainly many European states, or has been there in the course of this year. Nobody, the popular passions are running ahead, perhaps, of a sense of political reality and reason. On the other hand, these have political effects. So are the people really the holders of policy? Are they, in some ways, closer to what in Clausewitz in Trinity terms you see the government's position? And how far can the government, except in theory, remain distinct from it when you have a powerful press, when you have a government which in a democratic society is going to have that distinction is easier for somebody like Clausewitz to retain because he is still thinking how we will reform the democracy in order to get a more legal structure. We have a more legal structure, so how do we actually integrate it better?
It's a great question, Audrey, and there's a great backstory here with Colonel Colin Powell at the War College, and my former boss, my first boss out of Oxford, John Collins. I was reading Clausewitz for him and condensing it, doing everything wrong. Sorry about that, Hugh. I have to apologize to you right now.
You were in good company at the time. Everybody was doing it, including me.
Trying to make sense of it. I want to come back to the causes of war. Disconnected from Clausewitz, which you rightly say was more about the conduct of war, not the causes of war, and yes, disconnected from even the consequences in terms of policy. But just to think about the thousands of books written about World War I and the origins. Yours are the best, of course. but there's still no agreement on the causes of World War I. And yet, here is something that has been so exhaustively examined. And I want to make the distinction, of course, yes, that Clausewitz does between the unchanging nature of war, and maybe we can't go beyond Thucydides in terms of fear, honor, and interest. And then the changing and variable character of individual wars, where, as in World War I, we can point to where, though? Do we start back in the 1870s in the creation of the German state, or do we start with Sarajevo and the assassinations? The reason I want to ask that question is part to go back to Ukraine. Where does the Ukraine war begin? Did it really just begin on February 24th? So causes of war, just in terms of both the past, your own work, and in Ukraine.
Yeah, no, just a short question. Where do I start? Let me start with the First World War quite specifically. A general point first. Where you are now tends to be, of course, where you read your own history, where you read history. So I think there is a way in which we see different things in the past, just as we read Clausewitz differently now from how he was read during the war, because we have different preoccupations, and those are preoccupations which Clausewitz also happens to speak to, which none of us, not just Michael Howard and Peter Bray, didn't fully recognize in 1976. But their preoccupations are kind of dated because our preoccupations are different. We've gone from the Cold War, came back to it, but other things have intrigued. The specific point about the First World War is that I suspect that, in part, of course, you're absolutely right, it's about the role of long-term causation versus short-term contingency, and what happens actually in the July crisis. This is therefore relative. And so it relates to the Ukraine question. So when people wanted to prove German war guilt in 1919, they looked at the July crisis. When it came to exonerating the Germans, they looked at long-term causes of German unification. Then, paradoxically, of course, when Fischer wrote, he still used a medium-term distance to make the calls and argued that July was the trigger. So he brought the long-term and short-term causes together. If you read Christopher Clark's The Sleepwalkers, book on the origins of the war, they say almost nothing about the July crisis itself at all. And how you can understand the outbreak First World War in 1914 without looking at the July crisis and its dynamics is totally beyond me. Sorry, Christopher, I'm not. I respect both their works enormously, but it does seem to me that their publishers were breathing down the back of their necks and telling them to get the books in quickly so that July, because contingency matters. Now, what I think is happening in terms of the long-term debate is that there was a period when Germany was guilty, there was a period when Germany was not guilty, there was a period when Germany was guilty again. Now we're in one of those phases where Germany is not so guilty, and we'll be back shortly. It's a bit like the causes of the French Revolution, and no doubt the causes of American independence. You know, there'll be some variations in interpretation. Or the American Civil War, first American Civil War, as no doubt most Canadians will feel. So just to make let's look at Ukraine. Well, absolutely, the war did not begin in February, and that's one of the. I mean, I'm organizing a conference then next month in Chicago on the war, and I'm determined that effectively it's going to be February 2022. But it's an indication of our own myopia, because that clearly 2014 was the last point we could seriously consider and confronted and supported Ukraine in any sensible terms with a chance of deterrence, and we opted in. And I remember very clearly, and I won't name names because it's here, but I won't name names. But I was at a meeting just before the NATO summit in the British government department, and so I was briefing a group of us defense review, therefore. So the one thing we're not talking about is Ukraine, and let's be absolutely clear, this is one thing not addressed directly. In other words, it was off the agenda. And in a way, we're thinking, so why are we here? What have we come about? But of course, others will say it goes back to 2008. Others will say it goes back to 1994, or go back to James Baker, and promises made. I mean, so there's a long history. Mary Sir Russell will no doubt give the answers to the question, why does it take so long?
Oh, do you have another question?
Oh, a quick one. Americans use technology to try to reduce casualties.
Yeah.
And that's one way of managing politics. So technology has been very important in Ukraine. And I'm not even talking about technology on the battlefield. I would talk more about Starlink and the ability to maintain the connection to the internet that's given Zelensky the ability to mobilize people to follow him, and his own, domestic mobilization too. So given the arguments that you've made about the causes and consequences and unfolding of war, any comments you'd like to make about the role of technology now and into the future? Any changes you'd like to suggest, or with respect to Clausewitz?
Yeah, well, I mean, the beauty for me of Clausewitz is he's effectively in a technology-free space.
I know.
For somebody who did 1 year of science at school, this is a great relief. You ordinarily, it's a great disappointment. I understand that, but I think that I would argue one reason why Clausewitz has continued purchase is precisely because he's not technologically specific. Because in his era, the weaponry for war changed very little. 100 years before, basically, he would have recognized the battlefield, and it's not going to change dramatically until 10 years after his death in the process of industrialization and rapid technological change. Well, it does change the battlefield. But that means, because he's not essentially binding himself to a particular period technologically, he is binding himself very much to the legacy of the French Revolution. But in many ways, of course, we still live with the impacts of the French Revolution, so that doesn't distance him from us as much as it would otherwise have done. What does this mean, though? We unlike Clausewitz, we do live in a period of rapid technological change. And how you read the Ukrainian war, of course, is itself interesting, because in many respects, a lot of that all looks horribly familiar. I mean, urban fighting, tank warfare, counterattacks from small groups. I mean, there is a lot here that's technologically enabled. What I find most striking about the technological change is back exactly to your point, and you've hinted at it incidentally, it goes exactly back to your point about Afghanistan, is that what technology is doing for us is mobilizing popular support. And it's mobilizing popular support not just in terms of popular interests, but I've been very struck in British universities and from contacts I'm having indirectly at any rate, no, not directly too, American universities too, is that the academic population, because so much intelligence is open source, is much better informed, much more easily mobilized, and is much better at being able to give sensible input. And that, broadly speaking, certainly in the UK, the government has welcomed.
Yeah, I'm tempted to come in here and talk about your discussion about fighting limited wars, but not with unlimited ends, but not unlimited means. Because, and you even suggested, I think in your remarks here today, Hew, that if we're going to defend Zelensky in Ukraine with his existential war, then we ought to have no limits on means. But clearly, that's not possible, is it, in the nuclear era?
No, and I think part of the problem here is that Putin has actually, in a way, won a war he shouldn't have won. Let me explain what I mean. Very early on, he invoked the possibility of using nuclear weapons without actually, it would seem, intending to do anything at all. It was largely rhetorical, as far as we know. That is to say, sure, absolutely, all this is fingers crossed, and this is part of the problem. And that he didn't, there was no upgrading of the levels, there was no movement of missiles in accordance with this. But of course, that created panic. Frontline news, and for those in government in Western countries concerned about the possibility of escalation, it was a real concern. If you look at what's happened since then, the West has escalated its response. Not overtly, not by blowing it through a trumpet saying we're escalating, but actually just doing things. And as it has done those things, there's been a response. The West implicitly has established escalation tolerance. But we're not talking about nuclear weapons. We're not talking about chemical weapons. And I think part of the victory is to get us worried about nuclear weapons when we don't need to be. Again, fingers crossed. Because actually, if Putin is going to escalate this, he would logically escalate it in military terms in very different directions. He would escalate it geographically, do more in the Black Sea, for example. He could conceivably escalate it, because of the Article 5, by thinking how best to target the lines of communication to bring in those missions to the Ukrainians. Or he could simply escalate it within Ukraine by using longer-range missiles into the sea. It's not doing any of that at the moment. And, I absolutely caveat that. We don't know this. It's the realm of contingency. But it's also the realm of risk. And if you take fear of take too much fear out of this, then of course you're not going to expect the opportunity to risk. So where does that leave us in terms of limited means? Of course we can't move all the way up, but do we have any idea of where we are going? At the moment we're doing enough to keep Ukraine in the front, without the support from the United States, especially Ukraine would not still be in this area. But how long for? At what scale? What is the cost to US capability? What does it mean if you're putting so much into defense of Ukraine, budgetary terms, for defense budgets domestically in the countries that are supporting Ukraine? We're not having any of these discussions that I can see. And we're certainly not having in the United Kingdom, where we've got a regular army of 3,000. And we're still talking about a carrier strike group with global capability. politics. I mean, on global reach, when we have two carriers, but we don't have two carrier escorts. Where exactly is this going?
I wonder if we can switch to the consequences of war. I want to especially press you, Hew, on what you think about the consequences of the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan a year after that withdrawal, to the extent you can try to see any long shadow that comes out of that, and that's difficult at this point, perhaps. But I am struck by your analysis on the fall of empires out of World War I, the onset of the Cold War out of World War II, the revolutions in Russia and China. Now, maybe in hindsight, we can see all of those things. We couldn't see them necessarily in 1919 or 1946 exactly. But what do you think about the post-9/11 wars in general, Iraq and Afghanistan, but especially Afghanistan, given the fact that the withdrawal has had met with such controversy and near-term tragedy?
Sure. Well, it's very hard to distance, I think, for anybody who knows Afghanistan reasonably well, to distance yourself from the tragedy. I mean, people have been let down, very badly let down, and feel that. The speed with which we have moved on distresses me, distresses many other people, because, and I think what we're tending to do, reporting for me, is to devote our attention to the wrong issues. We are concerned, understandably, about the right to education for women, but we always knew that was going to be a problem. And if the Taliban were back in power, I remember going to a meeting in the Serena Hotel in 2011 with women's groups. We were all, even then, saying, you've given us so much, there is so much opportunity that has opened out. What will happen when you go? How is this going to be guaranteed? And we had no answers then, and we haven't got any answers now. But the humanitarian crisis is far more pressing, dare I say it. This is not minimizing the education for women and the rights of women. It's simply saying people are dying, that of starvation, and are dying because there's no cash in the economy, because funds are being withheld, because the state is not being recognized. These are much more fundamental things. And at that level, we don't seem to be able to move on. We don't seem to be able to say, because there's reluctance to recognize Afghanistan as a state, because of course it is, as shows it is, acting as a haven for terrorism. But actually, there is also the needs of the people who back the politics, if you like, from the policy, in terms of what's going on. So that's one dimension. What are the regional implications? What does it tell us about how that plays out? Pakistan, I suppose, is the key here, in terms of how the current state of Pakistan, combination of floods now, apart from that, the position of Imran Khan and what has happened recently there, the fact that Pakistan does seem to have pulled a bit away from the Taliban in the last few weeks, and it's done that before. But where will that be? But that seems to be our principal entree into Afghanistan. And what are the implications, of course, for the other neighbors? Implications for Iran, implications for Pakistan. And the real question for us is, and we don't know this, but if there were to be a recurrence of insurgency, there are reports of some fighters to the Panjshir Valley and on the Northern border, what would we do? How would we respond to that? And we don't know. We're not having that. Once again, we're not having that discussion. I think we did entirely the right thing, we, the West, Europe, other than the United States, in saying, particularly after the 1980s, we don't rush into the north and support the opposition to the Taliban, particularly when actually all that they can is react to ongoing continuing conflict. One benefit the Afghans have is that they don't have as much fighting going on, as much crime going on as they have before. So that is the upside. In wider sense, we don't know how much this influenced Putin's beliefs that we need to get over in February 2022, but it's hard not to draw that conclusion that this was yet another sign the West collectively in the United States particularly did not have an appetite for sustained conflict, and there wouldn't be a response. The other thing, I think, and I don't think the United States has taken this more fully, and I may be speaking entirely of Britain rather than the European, and Britain can't speak of the European anymore anyway. I think the hurt among the Allies had not been properly consulted by the United States in this sense. I mean, the Allies could have written a bit earlier and pushed a bit harder. But this was obviously US policy to go in the first place. It's the US entirely entitled to make its own decisions to come out. But a lot of other countries have committed themselves in the wake of this and were caught up in the backlash. Not as directly as the US, obviously, but still caught up. And I think the sense of being let down in the United Kingdom, and there was quite a push in the United Kingdom to think of a way of trying to scrabble together a coalition far too late to do something, but actually there was no purchase to achieve that. And that in itself, the United States should be worried that if actually, if the moment should have come with Ukraine for Europe to step up and do more for its own defense, arguably that should also have come in 2021. If they really felt they had an obligation, a humanitarian obligation, to continue to commit themselves beyond the American withdrawal, then they should have been really good about it. It was not even a discussion. NATO failed more catastrophically in the United States. 2021.
I don't want to be facile about history and current issues, but it's obvious that China, in major power war, and the concern of a clash over Taiwan, has gripped national attention in terms of the focus of both policy and discussion, including with our allies and partners. In terms of thinking about that confrontation, obviously the mainland has defined Taiwan unification as an existential issue. Now that's a subjective definition by Xi Jinping,
Sure.
because it's not objectively true that China will fall if Taiwan's not part, because it's never been part of the PRC. Nonetheless, maybe that doesn't matter. And meanwhile, the United States is looking at this narrow window in this decade, not long in the future, but in this decade, at the possibility of a military clash over Taiwan. Now, whether that could be a prolonged war or a short war, whether it will happen or just continue to be protracted political struggle, those are big questions that I don't expect you to answer, Hugh, but how would you help us think about the possibility of great power conflict in the 2020s?
Well, I suppose the easy way out of that question is you know far more about this than I do, actually. So I would immediately pose those questions to you. But the easy way out of it is to say that what is striking to me on the historical argument is the capacity of small powers to trigger the actions of big powers. I mean, that for me is the story here. Taiwan can get the US into a war which it doesn't want. And the US, I mean, I'm not accusing Taiwan of being manipulative or duplicitous in this, but you know, if I do my analogy stuff, then, and this disregards all the earlier stuff we've been saying about the origins of the First World War, this war begins at a clash in 1914 between Austria and Serbia, the Austro-Hungary and Serbia. And it's Serbia effectively which in its very well-judged response to the Austro-Hungarian alternative, make sure that Russia, and then France, and then Britain, Gray, the British Foreign Secretary, said at the time, I do wish we could just take Serbia out of the middle of the sea and sink it. It's such a nuisance. He really didn't care about Serbia any more than most Brits did. And then in 1939, a small power at the other side of Europe triggers a second global war. And right now, of course, we're dealing with another state, which we regard as a small power of our own way, which is also has the capacity to go away. So Taiwan sits, for me, exactly in that framework. And of course, you know, going back to 1919, it principle, we recognize the autonomy of states and their rights to determine their own futures. We see that as an important democratic principle. We recognize that in the UN Charter. We've recognized it through the massive explosion in numbers of states in the UN since 1945, tripling of members of states. Not all those states are able to defend themselves, in fact, the vast majority. And so where does that leave us? And it has to leave us either, this comes back to realism and liberalism, doesn't it? Essentially, if you're a realist, you say, there are so many potential wars out there, you should jolly well put your hard hat on and get out to a shelter and stay out of it. And the liberals would say, how can we let this happen? We have to be everywhere. So actually, in that situation, the liberals that will probably lead us into more wars than we want. But there are, so I think, I mean, that's the concern. The great powers continue to feel, how do you define your responsibilities? I think one of the, when people, in the early days of the China debate, I found myself going to the war college, as you know, and I found myself talking about other people who felt it was engaged in the process, not of absolute decline, but relative decline, because other powers were rising at the time. And of course, the US Navy had an interest in what the Navy had done, and we also used to say, absolutely clear, of course, that the Anglo-German naval arms the First World War, it was caused by the actions of other states. But that, and of course, it did lead to that confrontation, which is one of the why but I think that but that doesn't mean it has to happen. That's of course the whole point. And one of the reasons it need not happen is actually, ironically, if the United States focuses on its relationship with China rather than its relationship with Taiwan. And equally, if the United States, if China focuses on its relationship with the United States rather than with Taiwan. But if both sides let Taiwan be the center of attention, then they're in danger of finding themselves in situations where they're not in control.
Well, to segue from that very important topic back to history, but in terms of one that's right in your wheelhouse, in terms of the British way of war. There is this fabulous new book, as you know, The British Way of War. Andrew Lambert, is it?
Yep.
You're quoted in it, in fact, favorably early on, but there seems to be a...
I haven't read my review.
Well, I wondered about that because there is a distinction between your description of the continental commitment of Michael Howard's view versus his view that there is this British way of war that's separate from having a large continental army. I wonder if you could just kind of take us through very briefly this argument in the British way of war and why it matters.
Well, why I think it matters now, and why Corbett, this book by Andrew Lambert, for those of you who haven't read it, it is essentially a biography of Julian Corbett. But it's a biography that comes in two halves. The first half is a discussion of Julian Corbett, his life and his ideas. And although there's, to my mind, a lack of strategic context of some of this in the build-up to the First World War. But then the second half, it's an argument that there was a totally different way of conducting this war, which was in line with what Corbett had been thinking, which reflected, of course, a genuine debate between governments at the time in 1914 about whether Britain should ever have put an army on the continent, whether that one for British soldiers would have been enough. And you could have fought it, as Corbett argued in 1911, using sea power and having the privilege of an island, as the United States has the privilege of maritime separation from other countries, not from north and south, but in terms of its immediate competitors, and that and therefore you could take as much or as little of the war as you wanted, because it's a maritime conflict, and that Britain could have sustained that strategy. I just think the argument itself is unsustainable. I mean, the war was of a scale, but actually Britain did have to put on and fight a war. Lloyd George, who was well versed in maritime and economic arguments, strategy was sufficiently well versed, never embraced it. Because he realized, I mean, he did embrace it, but he embraced the need for a continental commitment as well. It wasn't high on war, both and he retitles in that book Corbett became the official naval historian of the First World War, and wrote the first 3 volumes of the official history of the operations, which were not completed when he died. And Andrew Lambert retitled some effectively the history of British ground strategy in the First World War. I paraphrase. The effect said, this is what it is. And it isn't. I mean, it simply isn't that. And nor is Corbett thinking in those terms. Or if he is thinking in those terms, I can't see the evidence for it. He doesn't. I mean, it will be good. There is a sense that comes out of that, which is that Little Hart picks up. Little Hart is a plagiarist, taking Corbett's arguments. But there is an argument that is the sort of war that we fought, and it's certainly the sort of war that many Brits should have fought in the 1920s and 30s, that Little Hart carries through to the Second World War. But again, it's actually the circumstances. And this is the problem for the United States, is the circumstances of being a great power very often leave you with very little choice about how you fight. And that, as Wellington famously said in 1838, tempted to say, he said that Afghanistan, but I think it's actually a part of Canada. Either way, there was an American residence here. But he said, there is no such thing as a little war for a great nation. In other words, if we're sucked into a fight, you can't actually lose. I find it, I'm delighted Andrew's written it. I've learnt a great deal from it, but I do get very confused. I think my reviews yet to come.
Now, Hugh, you famously set up the Changing Character War program, this truly interdisciplinary program at Oxford University.
Well, thanks to you.
On that, though you are a dedicated historian, so I'm wondering, what have you learned from the other disciplines beyond history, and what can history really bring to the world today? You've brought so much, but how would you phrase this in a couple of minutes?
I learned an enormous amount, initially somewhat against my expectation and will, about the interdisciplinary approach to it absolutely changed my thinking, because I learned from philosophers, from political science, from lawyers, international law. How do we define war? Well, war is an essential tool now for the definition of war. Not the only tool, but it's a tool that, thanks to the growth of international humanitarian law and wars on conflict, it's an essential tool. Absolutely, war needs interdisciplinary study. What does history specifically have to contribute? I think there are probably three things. One is, and this is not everything I do, of the core disciplines, military history, when it comes to the study of war, is the only one that looks exclusively at war. International law looks at other things. Philosophy is certainly concerned with other things. There are moments in some of those debates that during our satire, we slightly wondered whether the speculation of the bear pushes a rock over a cliff and there's a human being underneath, how far is the bear responsible? Those sorts of debates. I have to say very quickly to my philosopher friends, it was mostly not like that, but there were one or two times when you sort of wondered. But military history is concerned with war in one form or another at its heart. And no other discipline now, because I actually think strategic studies is itself an amalgam and sufficiently influenced by Michael Howard's legacy to think that he disputed the value of war studies or strategic studies at undergraduate level precisely because of practical reasons. And I'm even sufficiently the same way of thinking that military history absolutely is the central discipline. And I think we've lost sight of that sometimes, to our cost. Because what military history does, and this is the second point, is it gives context and perspective on the immediate. It gives a sense of what really is pressing now that is different. If I could put this in very personal terms, when the invasion began on the 24th of February, people started asking me comment. And I said, well, I'm not a, I don't know Russia. I am certainly not a Ukrainian specialist. You are. And the kickback was, yes, but you do think about war. And of course, I did find out head of reactions. But then the next question was, were you surprised? And the answer is, was I surprised? Yes, I was, but I wasn't shocked. Because in the end, partly because of 2014, 2008, and just because of how the experience of looking at wars over history, you're not surprised. But you still are surprised, are shocked in the sense that this happened. I think it's somehow going to happen again. So there's that element. And the third point, and I don't have the experience, but others in the room who do, is that it's a way, in the 20th century, we have valued quite rightly the experience of those who've seen war and combat at first hand, for whom this is an experience. This is not vicarious, but real and life-lasting. And what military history does is it gives context to that experience. It helps understand it. It helps those who've experienced it to put it in context, and it helps those who know those who've experienced it to put context to what they see. And that adds value to the experiences.
Well, we're out of time, and I want to thank you so much for your insights. There have only been 6 Chichley professors who've focused on military history and the modern war at Oxford in more than 100 and so years. And that's quite a tribute in terms of those individuals, what they've left. I'm reminded of the words of Cyril Falls when he was writing one of his books, 100 Years of War, 1850 to 1950. He said that the author does not intend to wear the sad clothing of excessive modesty. 30 years reading of military history ought to be an asset of a certain value. Well, I'd like to say that following his footsteps, you have shown amply, I think, Hugh, that the value of history and military history have a lot to say. And thank you so much for your scholarship. Thank you for your presence today on behalf of American University and Hudson Institute. Thank you to Hew Strachan.
Thank you very much.